Welcome to the Mind
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness,
Originals are nonconformists.
creativity,
People who not only have new ideas,
intelligence
they're the people you want to bet on.
in childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and welcome to episode 36 of the Mind Matters Podcast. Today we're speaking to Justine Fonseca. She is the author of The Caring Child, Raising Empathetic and Emotionally Intelligent Children. She's a return guest, and we're really excited to have her. Today, we're offering something that's pretty cool. We are doing a book giveaway. Justine has offered an autographed copy of her book, The Caring Child, and you can join in the contest to win this autographed copy. All you have to do is share any of our social media pages. You can share our Facebook or Instagram page, which is Mind Matters Podcast, or our Twitter handle is @MindMattersPod. And all you have to do is use the hashtag MindMattersSwag, and you will be entered to win. By the way, as you are listening, take one quick second and go ahead and subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, or leave us a review. It really helps us and we appreciate your help.
How about that? Is that good?
It sounds like everything's ready to go.
Perfect. Hi there, I'm Justine Fonseca, and I'm the author of the upcoming book, The Caring Child, Raising Empathetic and Emotionally Intelligent Children, and I'm so excited to be here today.
Justine Fonseca coming up next.
Previously on Mind Matters.
Hi, I'm Ann Lipkowski-Shoplik.
More and more today, a solution being considered for academically advanced kids is acceleration.
Having a student enter kindergarten early is actually the least disruptive form of acceleration, both in terms of academics and then also socially.
So what are some of the specific signs that indicate that a student might be a good candidate for acceleration?
Things like this child learns quickly and easily and has terrific verbal skills, uses very complex sentences, early math skills. A lot of very bright young children show an early interest in time. They're really fascinated by clocks. Early entrance to kindergarten has long-term consequences, and it's important for people to sort of process the thinking about that. These students are going to be ready for college at a younger age than typical.
Look for episode 34 wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Justine Fonseca is our guest today, and I was very excited to find out. I think I was actually the first person outside of your editors and publishing company that actually got to preview your book, and one of the things that struck me about it is how practical it is. I really liked that there are a lot of tips and suggestions for parents and teachers. Tell me a little bit about your decision to write this book for both of those types of readers, both parents and educators, and how challenging was that?
In all of the books that I write, I really try to write to both a parental audience and an educator audience, because I think those are the two most influential groups of humans, so to speak, in a child's life. So with this book, the challenge was trying to figure out where to put those educator pieces in. Do I want to just have chapters that are for educators, or do I want to have sections within each chapter? And I landed on this idea of these whiteboard topics because I was kind of thinking of, what would it be like if I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, and they had these lunchroom, whiteboard sessions that I could go to and learn little snippets of information. And so that's kind of how I wrote the book and outlined it, and really tried to take every chapter and then make it practical for use in a classroom setting. And then towards the end of the book, I have a bunch of role plays where I kind of present scenarios where this stuff is played out in real life. And I made one of those chapters just dedicated to scenarios that happen at a school setting, as well as the other two chapters in that scenarios that would happen in a home setting. So that was kind of my thinking behind it. I'm hoping to really be able to address the needs of both audiences.
I know that you also address a lot of the changes that kids really today are seeing. So, you tie it into the schools, you tie it into the homes, but then you're also addressing, how different it is for the lives of these kids from what we had when we were growing up. And you really talk about how those changes are impacting the emotional development of today's kids. What are some of the biggest changes that you see, and how do you think that's influencing the development of their emotional intelligence and empathy?
I'm so glad you asked about this. So one of the most definitive books I've read probably in the last year or two was a book called iGen by Dr. Jean Twenge. And it really talks about this generation of children who range in age from about 10 to college age. So it's that group. And then the group coming in right after them, which is called Generation Alpha, and that's 0 to 8, 9 years old. So those two generations. And what's unique about these generations more so than any previous generation is they are born into a world with smartphone technology. And I think when smartphones first came out and when technology first went through its changes, we kind of downplayed the impact of that. But what we're seeing with iGen is that the impact of smartphone technology is much bigger than we ever thought it would be. Mm-hmm. And what's happening is kids aren't growing up in the same environment that we grew up in, meaning most of us, when we were 16, we immediately went and got our driver's license, right? You probably got yours when you were 16.
Mm-hmm.
Kids today, average age of getting a driver's license is 22.
Wow.
Crazy, right? I can't even imagine that. And it's not just that. Kids are taking longer before they go out on their first date. They're taking longer before they hold their first job. So everything, all those kind of hallmarks of becoming an adult are happening later and later and later with this generation of kids. The impetus to do those things is just substantively different. Even going out to the mall and hanging out with a group of friends has been replaced with sitting in your room and texting your friends instead. And so there's some huge implications for that educationally, and there's huge implications for that in terms of social emotional development. One of the things we see is with as little as 2 hours of screen time or smartphone use technology a day, we are seeing changes, beginning to see changes in just how the brain's being developed. We're starting to see some differences in white matter, some malformations in white matter, and some differences in gray matter volume. And that has huge consequences. That has huge consequences for how we process and regulate cognitive skills. It has huge potential consequences for our social and emotional development. It's something we're going to have to pay close attention to. By no means think I'm anti-tech, because I'm not at all. We're not going to put that genie back in the bottle, right? But I am about balance, and I am about kind of doing this with your eyes open and really understanding the ramifications. Some of the research that Dr. Twenge has discovered is huge increases in feelings of social isolation in this population or in this generation of kids, decreases in self-esteem, increases in anxiety, increases in depression, and as much as a 200% increase in suicidal ideations, with onset age being younger and younger and younger. You know, we now have elementary school kids who are making very serious suicidal ideations. So clearly there's an impact, and clearly something has to be done. Mm-hmm. I think home life environments have really changed a lot too. You know, there's the impact of both families working. There's a lot more financial stressors on families. There's a lot more types of impact of trauma, both in terms of adverse childhood experiences, but also in terms of natural disasters and community violence and just the 24-hour news cycle and the impact that that can have. And so I think the environment in which kids are growing up is just really, really different. And I think we're just now beginning to understand the implications of that. And one of those implications is this real dichotomous generation that in one hand is less prepared for adulthood than any generation has ever been. And yet on the other hand is innovative and, you know, they speak out about injustice that they see and they want to take action. And so that's pretty dichotomous, right? That you wouldn't think of those things going together. We also see a generation that's very safe. They're not taking up drinking or drug use at the same kind of ages or engaging in risky sexual behaviors at young ages like they used to. And yet at the same time, they're terrified, mm-hmm. right? They're a very scared group, which is why we're seeing those increases in anxiety. So in writing this book, I really wanted to address all of that and help kind of set this stage for a conversation around how do we help kids, first recognizing that kids today aren't who kids were when we were kids. They just aren't. They're a totally different group of people. And so we can't approach it in the way we used to approach things.
I wanted to take a minute to talk about emotional intelligence, but I wanted to first define it so that everyone understands what we're talking about. I often hear people in the field of psychology who dislike the use of that term, and they feel like it shouldn't be discussed in the same breath as IQ. But what we're really talking about is sort of a family of emotional characteristics that help an individual develop healthy relationships and emotional well-being. Would you agree with that?
So yes, and to anyone who has issue with the term EQ and not being able to call it IQ, I would push back on that, because what we're talking about is a collection of about 12 broad skills, falling in 3 or 4 different kinds of areas, all of which occur as a byproduct of brain functioning. So how we can't liken those two things together, I'm very confused, because the very same things that we use to define IQ, which is the relationship between gray matter and white matter and what we do with those things and how our brain uses those things, we're still talking about the same dynamic. We're just talking about it in terms of a different collection of skills. So with EQ, or emotional intelligence, what I'm really referring to is some of the work that's come out of Harvard and Castle, and kind of a combination of the two, and a collection of cognitive regulation skills, emotional processing skills, social processing skills, mindset, and character development that, when used all together, kind of form the emotional or social emotional aspect of who we are as human beings. I like to think of it as all of those skills that make your IQ really accessible. So in the work that I do with families and in the trainings that I do with educators, I often will say, especially with reference to our gifted population, that your EQ really helps determine how much of your IQ you have accessible to you.
Right.
So for example, we all know some kids, there's adults who are exceptionally bright. Like, you put math equations in front of them and they're going to calculate them till the cows come home, but they can't hold a job.
Mm-hmm.
Or they can't hold a conversation with another human. And so even though they have off the chart intelligence, that's not going to get them anywhere in life. They're going to have some difficulties in life because they can't do all of the other things.
Right.
On the same side, we know people who maybe struggle with learning and struggle with intelligence, being able to form new ideas, being able to generalize intellectual skills from one domain to another, who maybe really struggle with that, but they're very strong socially. And so they will present in the world like they're higher functioning than maybe an IQ test, for example, would demonstrate. That's why a lot of people struggle with IQ tests.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the way that these two things interact with each other and how they influence each other. So I think both are important. I think it's important to develop both. And I think for our high potential kiddos, it's critically important that we develop EQ skills at the same rate that their IQ skills are being developed, so that they can make the most use possible of that beautiful intelligence that they have.
The importance of working with emotional intelligence with gifted and high ability kids, I think it all relates a lot of times to that cognitive ability and that masking. And sometimes they just don't explicitly learn the skills. Mm-hmm. And along with that asynchronous development, it kind of causes some obstacles along the way.
Sure.
And that's why I think, those gifted ed programs, when they do focus on that social and emotional development, it's such a vital part of that curriculum.
I completely agree with you. In fact, I was working with a district recently, and we were talking about they're a pretty progressive district in the sense that they're doing universal enrichment for all students, which I think is the exact right thing they should do. And so when I was working with the team of gifted educators, my question I posed to them is, if you're already doing enrichment for all students, then what do you feel is the role of the gifted program?
Mm-hmm.
I was able to get them to land where I wanted them to land, was that it's really about social emotional development. It's really about the unique needs that they have in that domain and the importance that we need to place on getting that EQ up and going so that some of those potential obstacles that can happen, especially as some of those skills are underdeveloped, doesn't circumvent their ability to maximize their intellectual potential.
So when we're talking about emotional intelligence, I know that empathy is a really big component there. So tell me about the connection between empathy and cognitive ability.
Sure. So I did a ridiculous amount of research for this book, and I found it fascinating that researchers are not in agreement on a definition of empathy at all or how it functions in the brain. It was a very interesting read. I kind of live on the side that believes that empathy and compassion are actually prongs of the same branch, so to speak. It exists on a continuum, so it's a matter of maturity, right? So empathy, as it relates to cognitive skills in particular, is really a culmination of your cognitive skills working well in harmony together, being fully integrated. And so for empathy to develop, we have some natural stuff we're born with. Things like our mirror neurons. If you walk into a nursery and one kid cries, what happens?
They all cry.
All of the kids cry, right? If you walk into a preschool setting and one kid starts to cry, what happens? Multiple kids start to cry, and the ones who aren't crying are caretaking the ones who are crying.
Yep.
And we see this, interestingly enough, in all sentient beings. So we can see this in, single cell organisms. We can see them react to one another through this process of mirror neurons. So to me, that is an aspect of empathy, but that's not what empathy is. Empathy is often defined as feeling into another. So we're kind of using our imagination to see the world from another's perspective and then being able to lean into that. So when I think of gifted children and high potential children, and I think of areas of overexcitability, and I think of the imagination area of overexcitability, it doesn't surprise me at all that one of the things we know from gifted research is that gifted children are very empathetic. They have the capacity to understand another's emotions very, very easily, very quickly, and at a very young age. Well, of course they do, because they also have a ridiculously good imagination. So for them to put themselves in the position of another is actually a really easy perspective switch for them. Where I think it gets difficult and where the cognitive piece really is important and the development of EQ is so important. With most of the gifted kids I work with, you have one of two extremes that often show up at a young age. So either they can intellectually understand someone else's feelings, but they're not really feeling them, right? And so they tend to be very judgmental about somebody's feelings. Like, I feel you in the sense of I know what you should be feeling. And, if there's no crying in baseball, there's no crying in baseball. So just stop kind of thing. Which is the intellectual part being really well developed, but their emotional and social part not necessarily being as well developed. And then you have the opposite extreme where you've got kids who have very strong emotional development and very strong, that emotional intensity kicks in, right? And so they can feel somebody else's emotions with no problem at all, but they haven't developed yet through their cognitive skills, that theory of mind to really understand the difference between self and other. So they tend to own somebody else's feelings and they get enmeshed with somebody else's feelings and they don't really know where their feelings end and the other person's feelings begin or vice versa. And so they can become extremely emotionally distressed as a result of their empathy. And I think we see that a lot in younger children who are high potential. And so, on the one hand, yay, they're high potential. They have this real ability to feel into another very easily. But we have to build some of these other skills because otherwise we've got a whole bunch of emotionally distressed children walking around. And I think that happens when you take a look at gifted programs and start talking with a lot of gifted kids.
So talk a little bit more about how compassion comes into play with all of this.
So to me, compassion is the full maturity of empathy. So I put in the book, I'm super proud of this one piece. In fact, an interesting short little aside that I think you'll appreciate as an author. So I had my book due and I turned my book in, and the very next morning I woke up with like what I considered like a mind-blowing model of how all of this could sit, like a framework. And I'm like, I just turned in the book. Dang it, right? And we were working on a really short time frame because I had needed a little of an extension on the book. So we were working on a tight time frame. So I immediately contacted my editor and said, so I have this idea of a little part I'd like to add. Can I do that during, when you're reading it for edits? Like, keep in mind, I want to add this one little section. And if you think it just nothing should be added, tell me that. But if I can get away with it, I'd really like to add like 4 or 5 pages plus these diagrams. And sure enough, she's fantastic. And she got right back in touch with me and said, I've already read your book. It's fantastic. You'll have very light edits. Adding this is no problem. So I breathed a sigh of relief. But basically in the book, you'll see a 4-box quadrant figure, and it really kind of lays out what I consider an empathy model fully integrated with other kinds of models of social environments and parenting that are out there, and kind of combines it all. And in the narrative around that, I really kind of explain compassion as being this mature version of empathy where you not only are able to feel into another and be able to really, from a visceral standpoint, feel another person's feelings, but you also have enough cognitive development that you can really understand the difference between self and other, and you can walk with somebody through their emotions without getting attached to their emotions. So you do not become distressed by another, have this compelling need to fix another's situation because you're looking at it from your viewpoint. Instead, you are walking with them through their emotions, offering support by giving them space to kind of live those emotions, and then having enough social awareness to be able to offer aid or assistance as is appropriate for the situation or for the person. To me, that's where we all want to reach.
Right.
And I think we are, as human beings, we get there sometimes, most of us, but it's a really hard place to live from all the time.
Yeah.
And so I use this little model even in my own as a human, even for myself, when I'm struggling maybe to feel compassion for somebody or a situation, I kind of refer back to this model in my head and say, okay, what's tripping me up?
Right.
Am I too emotionally distressed? Am I too in my head and I'm not really looking at this from a feelings perspective? My heart's not doing it, so that I can regulate myself even.
Earlier, you also mentioned something about enmeshment or becoming enmeshed.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the other things that's really important to remember is that within understanding empathy and compassion, there are some boundaries. And you were kind of talking a little bit about that with the difference between empathy and compassion.
Mm-hmm.
But what advice would you give for, parents or teachers or, just even as a conceptualization about why boundaries are important and how to implement those within the empathy and compassion for kids?
So yeah, boundaries are huge, right? They're a really, really big thing. And I think, in particular with any kid, high potential in particular, but any kid who is really high on the kind of social emotional development, but not nearly so high on that cognitive regulation side, there is this real tendency to feel so much into another that you're just taking it all on and you don't have good boundaries. And that's where we lead to, kind of get into some relationship difficulties when we get older, and even when we're in our middle school years, for example, and get taken advantage of by friends, et cetera. And so part of developing that side of the house, so to speak, is really about developing boundaries and not only understanding the differences between self and other, but also understanding what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, right? What should I do for another? What shouldn't I do for another? And learning how to establish those boundaries. And at home, I think that starts with parents doing a better job of establishing boundaries. As parents, it's really easy to get overly enmeshed in our kids' lives, right? And to project what we want on our kids instead of letting our kids grow up as autonomous, independent human beings with agency. And I think that happens a lot. And so we need to start with us and practicing good boundaries ourselves. There is a great saying in a parenting book, a very old parenting book, that was never give the milk away for free and never do for someone else something they can do for themselves. And it's really those ideas, right? And so if a person has the capacity to do whatever it is they're asking you to do, if they have the capacity to do it themselves, by all means, walk through it with them if they need a little bit of assistance, but have them do it. So in parenting, for example, I'll often say, if the kid can solve the problem, then the onus is on the kid to solve the problem. You can facilitate it as the parent by asking questions to lead them where you need them to land, but it's really important that they solve it. So let's take the example of the kid who leaves the homework at home. They need to figure it out now. Don't rescue them. Don't go rescue them and bring them the homework. Because if you do that, did they learn from the experience? No, we've all had the experience where we've forgotten something. So you figure it out. You figure out what to do with that teacher. We've all had the experience where we left a book at school that we need at home. Okay, we'll figure out a solution. But if we involve ourselves, if we solve it for them, if we do things for another person, then not only are we denying them the opportunity for growth, but we're creating difficulties around their boundaries. And the more difficulties they have with their own sense of self-efficacy and developing that and their own sense of worth and us being all involved in their boundaries and them being all involved in our boundaries, the more that happens, the less likely we will get really strong EQ development, the less likely we're going to get really strong and mature empathy development. And quite frankly, all of that speaks to resiliency also. So we're also going to start fragmenting resiliency because we're not going to have the kind of integration in our brains that we need that actually creates the biology of resiliency. So for all these reasons, it's really important to set boundaries. As parents, I am there to support my kid and be friendly with my kid, but I am not their friend, right? I am their parent. And it's a benevolent dictatorship in our house, right? It's not a democracy. And if I am a teacher, I have instructional control in the classroom, not the children. That is not to say I'm not going to give agency to kids. There are some kids for a variety of reasons. And I actually go into this part a lot in my book coming up at the beginning of next year around trauma. But there are kids for a variety of reasons who need some level of autonomy or agency in the settings that they're in relative to feeling safe and whatnot. And so as instructors and as parents, we need to learn how to lend agency or lend autonomy when necessary. But that doesn't mean we're giving it up. Ever.
No, I think that that's really important, like you said, to kind of model that and teach those things so that, the kids not only learning what they need to learn through that process, but also then seeing how to implement those in their own life.
And talk about it out loud, right? Like I am notorious for being lousy with setting boundaries about my day job life and my writing life and my family life. Like that all gets blended. And then I, wrap myself into a pretzel and then I'm not feeling like I'm doing good self-care and I get a little messy with it. And then I have to kind of write the rudder, right? Mm-hmm. And so I narrate that. My kids grew up knowing that was a challenge for me at times. And so they've walked with me when I've needed to kind of write that rudder and practice better self-care and get my boundaries back in check. And I'm just very open and transparent about it with them so that they learn that even as a fully realized adult human, you're going to have areas that you need to constantly focus on. And B, it's perfectly okay. What's not okay is to ignore it.
Right, exactly.
But being a work in progress is just called being human.
You also talk about mindfulness and how mindfulness can be used to enhance that empathy and compassion. How do you see that as a useful tool for this?
So mindfulness is one of the greatest tools that we have in our arsenal, I believe, when it comes to developing emotional intelligence in general, and certainly as it applies to empathy and compassion, for a couple of reasons. First off, really, really difficult to develop your emotional intelligence skills when you're not aware of the present moment. You're not aware of what you're thinking. You're not aware of what's going on around you. You're detached from kind of the present moment. And so mindfulness gives you the skill of learning how to, A, recognize when you're not being mindful, when you're not aware and present of the moment, and B, being able to get you back into that headspace. So that's one reason. Another reason is self-compassion. One of the key components based on the leading researcher into the field is mindfulness. And part of that is to, again, be able to hear your thoughts, being able to recognize when your brain is being honest with you and when it's not, being able to recognize when you are engaging in, I call it silly talk, but when you're when you're engaging in a lot of negative internalized behaviors. The gift of mindfulness gives you the ability to recognize when that's happening and then make a choice as to what to do about it. So if I want to regulate my thinking, if I want to regulate my emotions, if I want to regulate how I'm showing up in my social world, I need to first recognize what's happening right now.
Yeah.
To be able to do anything next. And mindfulness gives you that, is that tool that can give you that gift. So yeah, I'm a huge proponent of mindfulness.
So what advice would you give parents and teachers about getting started on this project?
we live in a complicated world right now. I think we can all agree with that. And we live in a world, certainly in the United States, but even worldwide, where we are, as a human species, more divided than we've ever been. And I think the need for healthy empathy, so that empathy that's not causing emotional distress, and that compassion and willingness to walk side by side with another and their life experiences and their emotional experiences. I think that's what's going to get us out of this kind of detached mess that we're in a little bit right now. And so I think learning, recognizing what's true about this generation, and then learning how we as parents or important adults in other younger humans' lives, how we can influence and kind of teach some of these skills and in our everyday life use every opportunity to talk about compassion, talk about empathy, talk about emotional awareness, bring mindfulness practices to bear. Anytime we can do these kinds of things, learn emotional flexibility, we need to. That's how we're going to kind of take our kids to the next level, so to speak, and be able to navigate through this increasingly complex world. In terms of what people can do to get started, it's as simple as paying attention to what kids are actually asking you at home. And if you're not having conversations, learning how to begin having conversations. Just how was your day conversations even with your kids. Get off the screens as adults, get off the screens as kids, go back to having some quality face-to-face, eye-to-eye conversations with each other, and just start there. And I think if that's all anybody did to start, we'd be a whole lot better off than we are currently.
Christine, thank you so much for your time today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Some final thoughts in just a minute.
If what you hear on Mind Matters makes a difference to you and your family, consider becoming a supporter. Through Patreon.com, you can chip in to help defray the cost of producing this podcast. Just decide how much you'd like to contribute, and that amount will be placed on your credit card every month. Even a couple of bucks would help cover the cost of producing the podcast and help us promote it to new listeners who could also use our help. Go to patreon.com/mindmatters and become a patron. And thanks for making a difference.
The double-edged sword of giftedness can go both ways when it comes to being empathetic. On the one hand, bright individuals tend to be open to new ideas and experiences, and that lends itself to understanding things from a point of view that is different than one's own. The flip side, though, is when gifted kids lean towards perfectionism. That can lead to some rigid thinking or perhaps a block when it comes to understanding the perspective of those around them, especially if that perspective is different than their own. Emotional intelligence includes a constellation of skills. It includes the ability to be aware of our own emotions, to be in tune with the feelings of the people around us, and to show flexibility in our thinking regarding situations or even our own beliefs. And these skills, like others, can be taught, nurtured, and built, which then leads to stronger relationships and success in other areas of life. We can help our children maximize their IQ through building their EQ. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time on Mind Matters.
Why don't we feel for each other? Can we still feel for one another?
Thanks for listening. Also, thank you to Justine Fonseca for being our guest. If you want to know more about her work, go to ChristineFonseca.com, and you'll find other information and links on today's episode page of MindMattersPodcast.com. Don't forget to share our social media pages with the hashtag MindMattersSwag to win an autographed copy of her book. There are contest details on our website. And hey, Instagram users, we definitely plan to spend more time with you, but we're only 2 people. Thank you for understanding. The executive producer of Mind Matters is me, Dave Morris. And for Emily and our dog Cooper, who keeps us company in the studio sometimes late at night, thanks for listening.
Why don't we feel for each other?
Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.